So here we are in the second half of Unit 2. Unit 2 is the Living World unit. We talked about biodiversity and the relationship to evolution and how that is really important for the maintenance of the ecosystem services that ecosystems provide for us. Now we're going to talk a little bit about species interaction and community ecology. So a lot of this is similar to the ecology you covered when you were in biology as freshmen. So this is what we're going to talk about: different species interactions, energy flow through food webs. We're going to talk about keystone species. We're going to talk about succession. Invasive species is something that we didn't really talk about in biology. That's a huge thing in environmental science. We're going to talk about restoration ecology. And chapter 4 also covers the biomes of the world. We're not going to talk much about the biomes. There's a project that you're going to do between chapters 4 and 5 that's going to relate to the biomes. So this is the case study. You guys are going to do a lab on this, and the case study for chapter 4 is on the zebra mussels. So the line is black and white and spread all over. In the 80s, they discovered that zebra mussels had come into the Great Lakes through something called ballast water. Ballast water is water that ships take in and expel as their cargo levels change. Ballast helps ships to remain upright. If there's not enough ballast in a ship, the ship will capsize. So they take water into these tanks, and then when it's time, they spew the water out of the tanks. So these zebra mussels got into the Great Lakes from water from European ships. They took water in over in Europe. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and then they dumped their water into the Great Lakes. 6 years after 1988, so 1994, they had spread down into the Mississippi River watershed, hit 19 states, and as of 2018, they are in 30 states. There's a map later on in the lecture that will show you the spread. So they don't have predators in the Great Lakes. They don't have parasites in the Great Lakes. So because there were no limiting factors on them, they spread like wildfire. For humans, this is the picture at the bottom here is a water intake pipe from a power plant or an industrial factory. There's a lot of industry all around the Great Lakes. So these things will get into every possible nook and cranny and just settle. Mussels are sessile. Okay, so they attach to the bottom or whatever surface they can find with byssal threads. So in terms of human impact, they clog water intake pipes, they damage docks. They can become the docks and the fishing gear and the boats can become so laden with these zebra mussels that they collapse or they sink. In the first 10 years of their existence in the Great Lakes, they have cost over $5 billion in terms of economic impact, which is kind of crazy. There's a picture down the line in the lecture. Zebra mussels are filter feeders. So they eat the plankton, the little floating critters, the phytoplankton in particular. They filter feed that out of the water. So they filter feed the phytoplankton, the zooplankton that live in the Great Lakes that feed on the phytoplankton don't have a food source, so they deplete. So basically, they're getting in at the bottom of the food chain, food web, energy pyramid, however you want to look at it, and ripping the bottom out. So if the zooplankton have nothing to eat, then the things that eat the zooplankton have nothing to eat, and it just goes up and up and up. Native mussels, like you can see here in clams, these little zebra mussels colonize on top of them. Like I said, any solid surface, and they can't open their valves to feed. They suffocate. So it's causing issues all throughout the Great Lakes. Changing the ecology of the Great Lakes has actually kind of started to backfire on the zebra mussels. There's another invasive species called the quagga mussel that's now competing with zebra mussels. And now that the zebra mussels have been around for a long enough period of time, native animals are starting to use those mussels as a food source. They realize that it's edible, so they are starting to use them as a food source. So the tide is turning as far as zebra mussels go. So if you look at how species interact in a community, if you have an organism, when two organisms seek the same resource, they are in competition. There's two kinds of competition, and we didn't talk about this in biology. Intraspecific competition takes place between members of the same species. So when two male deer compete for a female, or when fish compete for food or anything like that, intraspecific between members of the same species. Interspecific is between members of different species. And here's our Captain Obvious statement for at least this part of the chapter. Competition becomes more intense when populations are more dense. When there are more individuals competing for the resource, the competition raises. Okay, it's more intense competition. If you wind up with one species that is a stronger competitor, in the case of the zebra mussels are a stronger competitor compared to the native mussels because they don't have any native predators or parasites. That's called competitive exclusion. So the zebra mussels were so competitive that they prevented the native mussels from getting the resources that they needed. If the competitors are like evenly matched, they call that species coexistence, but that's not a big thing that we need to worry about. If two species coexist, they're going to change their behavior to minimize competition. Competition is never a good thing between species, because one of them usually suffers. But as two coexisting species coexist, they're going to alter something called their niche. Sometimes it comes out of my mouth niche, sometimes it comes out niche. It's like envelope and envelope. But a niche is a role of a species in an ecosystem. So the resources it uses, the habitat it uses, the consumption of food, and that kind of thing. So niche is something we may have talked about in biology, or niche. But there's your definition. This is something that the College Board likes to talk about. We talked about natural selection in the previous chapter, section of Unit 2. So over the course of a lot of generations, natural selection can favor something called resource partitioning. So you have individuals use a shared resource in different ways. This, is a tree, and this could be a tree in your backyard. And we've got 4 different species of birds, all using the same resource. So the resource is partitioned. So you've got the white-breasted nuthatch, right, that starts at the top of the tree and climbs down. You've got the brown creeper that starts at the bottom of the tree and climbs up, all looking for insects, probably the same species of insects too. The pileated woodpecker, these things are so cool. They're about the size of a duck. Huge, huge woodpeckers. They dig pretty deep into holes, into trees to find bigger insects. The yellow-bellied sapsucker is another kind of woodpecker, but it is going to drill small holes and is going to consume sap and the insects that are stuck in sap. The pileated woodpecker digs deeper than the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So we have 4 different species of birds, and again, this is just an example, using different parts of the same tree or different depths in the tree or things like that, So all 4 of these species can coexist because of resource partitioning. Another species interaction is predator and prey. So predation is when individuals of one species, which is the predator, in this case the lynx, they capture, kill, and consume the prey, which in this case is the hare. This is a classic graph, and you guys are going to see this graph when we do the zebra mussel lab. Predation is going to look at population dynamics. Predation is going to impact population dynamics. So if you have an increase in the prey, which are the hares here, the predator species is going to go up at some point. Okay, so you're going to have a lot more lynx to hunt for all these hares. So if you have a lot more lynx to hunt for all these hares, eventually it's going to be too many lynx for the number of hares that are left. They're going to over hunt, over predate. So then the hare population drops. If there's less to eat, then the lynx population is going to drop. So normally it's like an opposite pattern. As the prey population goes up, the predator population goes up to a certain point where that prey population can't sustain that number of predators. So the prey population goes down, so the predator population goes down. Okay, and you can see that pretty clearly in this graph between the hare and the lynx over, almost 100 years. This kind of makes sense. This goes back to chapters 3 and 11. If you have a predator that's better at capturing prey, another Captain Obvious, it's going to live longer and it's going to reproduce. And it's going to then pass those good hunting traits onto future generations, okay? Because they're going to be able to eat, survive, and reproduce. The risk of death is real if you're prey. So they have a lot of defenses, over the course of time that they've developed a lot of defenses over the course of time that prevent them from being prey, from being eaten. So there's a gecko. A gecko is a prey. And, if we didn't see the eyeball, we can't see that gecko. So that's a good camouflage. Yellow jackets, okay, poison frogs are brightly colored, okay, which kind of signals that it's dangerous. You've got that caterpillar, okay, they do mimicry to make a predator think it's a snake, okay. Some butterflies that are prey have eye spots, or what look like eye spots, to prevent birds from eating them. Parasitism is another kind of relationship where organisms depend on each other for nourishment. Okay, so how is this different than predation? In predation, the whole predator's purpose is to kill and eat the prey. Okay, parasitism doesn't usually result in an organism's death, right? So the parasite and the host. The parasite is going to live within inside the host, but it is to the parasite's benefit not to kill the host, because if the parasite kills the host, then there's nothing else left for the parasite to live on. So parasites can live inside, like a tapeworm. They can live on the outside, like a lamprey, or they can be free living. Cuckoos actually lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and that's considered parasitism. Brown-headed cowbirds and starlings do the same thing. So they'll lay their eggs in another bird's nest, and then the eggs are going to hatch. The mother bird and the father bird take care of the eggs, incubate the eggs. When the babies of the invasive species, the parasitic species, hatch, then those babies usually hatch earlier, are bigger and stronger, and they compete with the babies of the host species, and they do better at getting food. Sometimes they'll even knock the host babies out of the nest as a way to compete. So it's kind of sad, but it's true. A parasite that causes a disease is called a pathogen. You can have pathogenic protists, bacteria, or viruses. We're aware of that. Sometimes as a host adapts, the parasite may not be as good of a parasite for that host anymore. So then the parasite adapts to the adaptation of the host, and that's called coevolution. Herbivory is plant predation to an extent. Normally insects are the biggest kind of herbivore. And if you look at some plants, plants have developed defenses against herbivory. So chemicals, thorns, spines, irritating hairs, all that kind of stuff. Even plants have defenses against attack. Another kind of species interaction is mutualism. Mutualism is where two or more species in a relationship benefit each other. So in some cases, those relationships, mutualistic relationships, are symbiosis, where you have two or more species that are closely physically associated with one another. So if you look at termites do not have the ability to digest wood. So then why do termites eat wood? Because they have bacteria living in their gut, digestive system, I use the term loosely, that allow them to digest the wood pulp. So the bacteria has a place to live. They get that benefit, and the termite gets the nutrition from the bacteria digesting the wood. Tube worms, giant tube worms along the mid-ocean ridge are like that too. They live down in the deep, dark parts of the ocean where there is no light, but yet there are these huge ecosystems that exist there. So how does that happen? The tube worms have chemosynthetic bacteria in their tissues. So the tube worms live in areas where you get a lot of hydrogen sulfide and typically, toxic substances pouring out of these mid-ocean ridge vents. So they live in that area. The materials, those hydrogen sulfides, will make their way into the tube worm's tissue, where those bacteria can process them and turn them into food, in quotes, that the tube worm can use. Okay, so that's symbiosis. Pollination is another mutualistic relationship, but the pollination relationship only has to happen once in order to be beneficial. So you've got the hummingbird gets the benefit of the nectar, and then the flower gets the benefit of pollen being moved from plant to plant and reproduction. So definition of a community is a bunch of populations of organisms living in the same area at the same time. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So a population is a bunch of different, a community is a bunch of different populations living in the same place at the same time. So you can talk about the ecological community of Hunterdon County. You can talk about the different populations that make that up. You've got the oak trees and the squirrels and the deer and the bacteria and the bears and the wildflowers of all the different species, the invasive stuff, the stilt grass and the spotted lanternfly, and all of these things together make up the community. If you are into that kind of thing, you can become a community ecologist. So it talks about species interactions and how communities change over time and why. Community ecology is becoming a pretty hot area of study in environmental science as climate change creates adaptive pressures on a bunch of different species. And typically, a lot of the community interactions that we look at, or community ecologists look at, deals with who eats whom. So it's a transfer of energy. So we can look at a community in terms of feeding relationships, and every species within a community is given a rank within the feeding hierarchy, and they call that a trophic level. We talked about that. So producers are at the bottom, okay, at the first trophic level. They use photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, like I talked about with the tube worm bacteria, to make their own sugar. Okay. If you go up, the next level up, next trophic level up, are the primary consumers. They consume producers. Now, the pictures that are here in the text give you an aquatic feeding relationship that's on the left-hand side, and then a terrestrial one, which is on the right-hand side. So phytoplankton are the aquatic producers. The primary consumers, the things that eat the phytoplankton, are the zooplankton. The grass is the producer on a terrestrial example, and then the grasshopper is the primary consumer that eats the grass. Okay, secondary consumers prey on primary consumers. And then tertiary consumers prey on secondary consumers. So you see what we're working on here. So phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton are eaten by fish. Fish are eaten by cormorants. There is usually a marine, or it could be freshwater, feeding relationship. In a terrestrial relationship, you've got grass, which is being eaten by a grasshopper. Grasshopper is eaten by a rodent, in this case a chipmunk. The rodent gets eaten by the hawk. All right. Regardless of where you are in terms of trophic level, detritivores, okay, water molds, aquatic bacteria and crayfish, and decomposers, okay, they are really responsible for taking the waste and helping it cycle back into nutrients. And we're going to talk about nutrient cycling in chapter 5. So detritivores are going to scavenge waste and dead bodies. So these are fungi. These are vultures. Okay, in the aquatic world, they're given crayfish the credit for that. Your decomposers are typically bacterial and some fungi too. So I already spoke about the important role that they play. Okay, so this should look kind of familiar. You can look at a pyramid like the one you see here. It's a pyramid of energy, a pyramid of numbers, or a pyramid of biomass. Either way, it's a pyramid. So it's bigger at the base, and then it gets smaller as you go up. Okay. This is a rule that you need to know. It's the 10% rule. I know I talked about the 10% rule. From one level to the next, okay, only about 10% of the energy or the organisms or the biomass is in the level above. Okay. So 10% of 1,000 is 100. 10% of 100 is 10. 10% of 10 is 1. So this could be 1,000 joules of energy and 100 joules of energy and 10 joules of energy and 1 joule of energy. Or it could be 1,000 grass plants and 100 grasshoppers and 10 chipmunks and 1 hawk. Okay. Only 10% of the energy or whatever goes from one level to the next. All right, Mrs. Grady, that's fine. Where does the rest of it go? So this grasshopper, these 100 grasshoppers, need to take some of that energy that they get from the grass, and they need to grow. They need to reproduce. They need it to sustain their bodily functions, okay? So it's used for maintenance. That's what that means. Or it's lost as heat. The metabolic processes of photosynthesis and respiration are extremely energy inefficient. So a lot of the energy goes to heat. More of it goes to heat than it does maintenance. But I am telling you, you're going to see a pyramid like this somewhere, and you're going to have to do math with it. You need to know about the 10% rule. That's just the way that it is. Okay. Biomass is the collective mass of living matter at a given place and time. So the biomass here in this case is 1,000, right? So if we look at this pyramid, this pattern of energy and biomass, it explains why if you eat at a lower trophic level, it decreases your ecological footprint. It goes back to the ecological footprint lab that we did. Okay. So let's say this is grass. Well, it is. And this is a cow, and this is you, okay? Because if you eat meat, you are a secondary consumer, okay? So it takes energy from the grass to raise the cow, right? Plus any other additional energy we have to put in to grow the grass and all that kind of thing. So if it takes energy from the grass to grow the cow, there's only 10%. That makes it from one level to the next. And then only 10% of that cow gets to us, right? So it's more energy efficient if we become the cow rather than eat the cow. So that's why veganism, vegetarianism is a better solution to decreasing your ecological footprint. Again, not that I am going to sit here and promote veganism because, I like a hamburger just as much as anybody else. But it's one solution that you guys can do to reduce your ecological footprint. So one thing that you need to understand when we look here at a pyramid like this, it's energy that's flowing from one level to the next, to the next, to the next. Okay? So if you were to draw arrows, the arrow would go in the direction of energy flow. Okay? It would go from the grass to the grasshopper, from the grasshopper to the chipmunk, and then from the chipmunk to the hawk. The arrows don't show who eats whom. It shows the direction of energy flow. Okay? Because if the arrow goes like this, you're going to tell me the grass eats the grasshopper, but that's not true. It's the flow of energy. And that's what this is talking about. Okay? If you look at this, what we've created here in this pyramid is a food chain. Okay? It's one individual set of relationships in a community, feeding relationships in a community. But we know that chances are this chipmunk or this population of chipmunks eats more than just grasshoppers. So in order to really provide a clear picture of feeding relationships in a community, we use a food web. If you take a whole bunch of food chains and you overlap them, you get a food web. And here's a fabulous looking food web, okay? These are your decomposers, right? Your detritivores and decomposers. Here's a parasite, right? I strongly suggest that you guys be capable of reading and interpreting a diagram like this. Just saying. Certain organisms play a bigger role than scientists think that they should, okay? Based on the abundance of that species in a community, okay? Those are called keystone species. And we'll talk about why they're called keystone species on the next slide. So some examples are decomposers that recycle nutrients and replenish the soil. If you get rid of those decomposers, the ecosystem is not going to function as normally as it should. So they're considered a keystone species. They call them ecosystem engineers. Beavers and prairie dogs, they physically alter their ecosystems. And some top predators who do a really good job of controlling lower level consumers. Okay. So here's why they're called the keystone species. If you think about architecture, okay, a keystone in architecture is a stone, the stone that keeps the arch up. If you pull out that keystone, the arch collapses. The arch can't stand up. All right. So if we look at the example here, in this case, in a kelp forest, like out in California in Monterey Bay, the sea otter is a keystone species. Okay. The sea otter eats sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. Okay. So kelp forests are some of the most productive and biodiverse aquatic marine ecosystems. So these sea otters are here. They are eating the sea urchins. So that way the kelp doesn't get overgrazed. So there's enough habitat and support for a whole variety of species that live in the kelp forest. Okay. Sea otters were hunted for their fur. So if the sea otter gets overhunted for their fur or some other kind of reason why the sea otter is absent, the sea urchins explode. The population grows out of control. They're unchecked because the sea otters aren't there to eat them. So the sea urchins graze the kelp to almost nothing. So all of those species that depended on the kelp can no longer survive. All right. So that's, and then everything collapses. They call it a trophic cascade, right? It's like an avalanche. Everything just falls apart. It's like playing Jenga, right? You take the wrong piece out of the Jenga tower and everything falls apart. It's the same idea. A disturbance is any event that has rapid and drastic effects on a community and the whole ecosystem. Okay. Different communities respond to disturbances in a number of ways. And there are some examples. Okay. They can be small and localized. So when a tree falls in the woods, you have the forest canopy is all like dark. But if a tree falls, there's a gap in the canopy. So that's going to change the ecosystem in the spot around where the tree fell. A disturbance can be large, like a hurricane or a flood, like we just went through. And disturbances can also happen regularly, like a prairie fire or an outbreak of insects. Okay. A community that resists change and remains stable is said to be resistant to the disturbance. Okay. If you don't get poison ivy, even though if you get the oil on your skin, you're resistant to poison ivy. Okay. So a community that doesn't change in the face of a disturbance is resistant. If a community gets changed, but it comes back to its original state, it's said that that community is resilient. It has resilience. So it's like I get knocked down, but I get up again. All right. So there's a disturbance, but it can come back. So you can have a community that is resistant, but not resilient, and vice versa. Disruption happens on a bunch of timescales. It can be periodic, so it's regular and it's predictable, like the tides. The tides are a disturbance that happens all the time, within the same time frame, monthly, daily, seasonally. Okay, so that's very predictable. And organisms, some like tide pool, intertidal organisms, are very well adapted to that periodic disturbance. Sometimes the events are episodic. It's irregular and it's unpredictable. When we get to chapter 16, we're going to talk about El Nino, and how that is irregular and unpredictable. Changes in sea level with changing glaciation. It doesn't necessarily happen at the same time frame. Okay, and then hurricanes. Hurricanes are irregular and unpredictable. They are more regular than something random, but they are less regular than something periodic. Random events, it just kind of happens when it happens. You can't predict it. You don't know it's coming, like a volcanic eruption. If there is severe disturbance, like when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, really severe disturbances, floods, volcanic eruptions, can get rid of all or most of the species that were in a community. It's a devastating disturbance. What happens afterward is called succession. It's a bunch of changes, and we're going to look at succession on the next slide, a picture of succession. The first species that come in as a result of succession are called pioneer species. Pioneer species are really important because depending on if it's primary or secondary succession, they can be lichens that come and turn bare rock into thin soil, which then sets the stage for everything else afterward. Or in a secondary succession situation, grasses and other plants called forbs are adapted to spread quickly and reproduce quickly. So they're really good at stabilizing the early stages of succession. That's the beginning of succession. The end of succession, what you get to at the end, is a climax community. Hardwood trees. The biomes that you guys are going to look at when you do the biomes project are considered the climax community. It's like what you wind up getting to at the end of succession. So primary succession happens when there's nothing left. Okay, a disturbance gets rid of all plant life, all soil, everything. There's nothing but bare rock, and you can see that here, okay? This happens in a lot of cases in a volcanic eruption, like when the Hawaiian Island volcanoes erupt, there's new land where there wasn't ever land before, so that's going to start primary succession. So you start with bare rock, the lichens come in and start to make some thin soil, and you can see the soil formation here. There's nothing here, and there's starting to be a little bit towards the end of the lichens. The lichens set the stage for the grasses, small herbs, and forbs, okay? And then as the soil thickens, you wind up with shrubs and fast-growing trees, shade-intolerant trees, and then trees that are shade-tolerant, kind of like what we have around here. So you start out with no soil, and over the course of time, you build soil. That's primary succession. What you wind up with at the end is a climax community. Secondary succession, you can see here, okay? Secondary succession happens when there's soil already, okay? There's soil that was there, but the community above the soil changes. So when you have a fire come through, when a farmer farms a field, what we've dealt with after the flooding and landslides and any change in the surface that didn't get rid of the soil is going to go through secondary succession. So the property that I built my house on was a farmer's field. So it was a stand of trees. And my father moved up into the area where we live in the 70s, and he was farming it. And then they stopped farming it sometime in the 80s, and it went from a field, a farmed field, to like cedar trees and hardwood saplings and lots and lots and lots of multiflora rows. So over the course of my life, I watched it go through secondary succession. It's kind of neat. We're going to skip that. Invasive species. Okay, this is a big thing. So before we get to invasive species, we're going to talk about introduced species. So an introduced species is a species that's introduced into the community. It's not native, and people bring it. Okay. Most introduced species don't survive. Okay, because the conditions aren't right. But there are some that thrive, and those are called invasive species. So if it's an introduced species that survives and thrives, then it's called invasive. Okay, introduced species can become invasive when the things that normally regulate their population growth aren't a thing. So there's no competition, there are no predators, there are no parasites. Okay, once that happens, it's like they grow in gangbusters. So zebra mussels were introduced accidentally, and they became invasive because they didn't have any of those factors, and they had positive effects and negative effects on the Great Lakes community. Okay, so let's look at the red arrows first. The red arrows are the negative impacts. So negative impact on humans, you've got economic loss, and it shows, right? Colonizing the docks, filling the water intake pipes, okay? Just making a general mess of the things that we want to do in terms of economics on the Great Lakes. If you're a phytoplankton, okay, the zebra mussels are not going to be cool because they're going to eat you up, right? So they filter feed, they suck out all the phytoplankton. They just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. If the zebra mussels are eating the phytoplankton, it stinks for the zooplankton too, because now the zooplankton have nothing to eat. And the fish that eat the plankton, both the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, have nothing to eat. So it stinks if you're phytoplankton, zooplankton, or a plankton-eating fish. And then we also talked at the beginning about the fact that the native mussels and clams get all choked out. They can't open their valves, so they get suffocated. So those are all the bad things that the zebra mussels can do. However, there are some good things that the zebra mussels have done for the Great Lakes ecosystem. So if you take all of the plankton out of the water, when you go to the shore and the water is really like cloudy and green, it's a plankton bloom, right? If you have these mussels that are sucking all the plankton out of the water, that's going to make, it's going to decrease something called turbidity. We're going to talk about turbidity. Turbidity is like the cloudiness of the water. If you suck all of those plankton out, that water is going to get a lot clearer. It's going to let sunlight penetrate deeper into the water. So those bottom dwelling aquatic plants are going to have a field day because they can grow more because they have more sun and they can do more photosynthesis. If you are a benthic bottom dwelling invertebrate, okay, and you're a bacterium and you've got all of this dead stuff falling, it's like a feast raining down from above, okay? And anything that feeds on the bottom is going to have a lot better food source because of the fact that the water is clearer and all of, the phytoplankton and the zooplankton and the plankton eating fish are dying and falling to the bottom, okay? So these zebra mussels changed the community in the Great Lakes, the ecosystem of the Great Lakes community. It's different, but is it necessarily bad? Good question. So here's that map I was talking about. The zebra mussels as of March 2016, okay, they are all in the Mississippi River, okay? This is the Hudson River, okay? They are all over the Hudson River, and the lab you guys are going to do includes data from the Hudson River. All right. The quagga mussels are this purple as well. And the green are the quagga mussels. So they're down here, which is crazy that they got all the way down here, into the southwest. Okay. They're not really getting out here too well because of the mountains. Okay. The mountains are a barrier to allow those mussels to spread. And there has been some successful eradication, a couple of these yellow pows. 3 of them I can see. So what do we do? How can we deal with invasive species? We can control them, we can get rid of them, or we can prevent them. All right? So as humans tend to do when there's a problem, we write a law. We legislate. So there was something called the National Invasive Species Act of 1996. That said that ships have to dump their freshwater ballast at sea. So they have to dump their ballast out here before they go into the St. Lawrence Seaway. Okay. So that way, if they have any zebra mussels, the Great Lakes are freshwater. If they have any invasive freshwater species in their ballast, it goes out into the salt water so they won't survive and they can't spread. So that's one thing that ships have to do now as the result. So that's prevention, right? You can control it. Okay, you can try to control them. So you apply toxic chemicals, you heat them up and they die. You can blast them with sound and they die. You can zap them with electricity. You can zap them with UV light. And you can introduce carbon dioxide, which stresses them out to the point that they die. But to control them and to get rid of them is really expensive. So most of the efforts have been given to prevention. When communities get changed, whether it's a natural disturbance or a human-induced disturbance, you can restore an ecosystem to increase ecosystem service function. So you can be a restoration ecologist. This is a thing. You look at ways to put ecosystems back to the way that they were. So you want to restore the functionality of an ecosystem when you're trying to restore an ecosystem. So you're going to let it do the ecosystem services that it's been doing. And you put a community back to its pre-settlement conditions. You fix it. And this is one thing that they're doing. In the Florida Everglades, they installed canals and dams and levees as a way to control the flow of water that degraded ecosystem services in the Everglades, in the swamp. So now what they're moving to do is to restore the river. This is a beautiful meandering river. So it has the ability to flow and do what it needs to do rather than to be forced into this channel. Another thing that they're doing is going after invasive species. Okay. Another issue in the Everglades are a couple invasive species. One is garlic mustard. Okay. which is ridiculously invasive. And then the Burmese python. Okay, Burmese pythons have been known to eat alligators and birds in the Florida Everglades. So they're working on getting rid of them. It started out as pets being dumped, pets that people didn't want anymore, being dumped into the swamp. And they are a real invasive species, and they cause lots of issues. Okay, so this is the biomes section that I had mentioned. Communities at different areas on the earth, they might be in very wide areas, like Canada and Siberia. But there are patterns of similar structure and function and even species. So if you have a bunch of similar communities together, the climax community, they call it a biome. So biomes are typically classified based on their dominant plant type, which is the result of climate. This is a very, very cool diagram. So climate is based on temperature and precipitation. Okay, so this talks about the x-axis, talks about the amount of precipitation from dry to wet. And then the y-axis talks about temperature from hot to cold. So if it's dry and hot, we call it a desert. If it's wet and hot, we call it the tropical rainforest. If it's dry and cold, it's the tundra. Okay, so this is a very cool diagram to kind of help you figure out temperature versus rainfall. Okay, temperature and precipitation are related to latitude. So you can see the different biomes. Okay, so these are the biomes in terms of precipitation and temperature. This is how that's spread throughout the world. All right, which is really kind of cool. Climate changes with elevation. So as you go up in altitude, you get less temperature, less atmospheric pressure, and less oxygen, but the amount of ultraviolet radiation increases. The rain shadow effect we're going to talk about in the key points part, which creates the rain shadow effect is actually really cool, and I've seen it in person. So it's just going to be easier for me to explain it to you when I can go through my example. So the rest of these slides give you details of all the different biomes that we saw in that triangle diagram. They give, when you look at biomes, you see something called a climatograph or a climate diagram. I don't like the way our textbook does these because they use lines for both. I prefer to use a line for temperature and a bar graph for precipitation. So when you guys work on the biomes book project, or whatever I decide to use for the biomes project, you're going to see graphs with bars instead of two sets of lines. So the rest of this just goes through all of the different biomes, and you can see dry conditions versus wet conditions in all of them. All right. So I'm not going to sit here and read these to you, but that's what they are. All right, guys. Thanks a bunch.